The stars stretched endlessly before the horizon's edge as it approached the massive station, hanging in space like a jewel suspended against darkness. Captain Derek Hamilton stood on the bridge watching the structure grow larger on the viewing screen, and he felt his heart beat faster with each passing moment. This was it, the moment humanity had dreamed about for centuries, the moment they would meet civilizations older than human history itself and take their place among the stars. Lisa Martinez adjusted her formal diplomatic robes and studied the data streaming across her tablet. She had spent 2 years preparing for this meeting and learning everything Earth's computers could tell her about the Galactic Sovereignty Council. 12 ancient species ruled the galaxy together, and they had done so for 10,000 years. Their technology was beyond human understanding, and their knowledge spanned millions of worlds. She glanced at Derek and saw the same mixture of excitement and nervousness she felt in her own chest. The communications officer turned in his seat and spoke quickly. The council was hailing them and granting permission to dock. Derek acknowledged the message and guided the ship toward the docking bay. Through the windows they could see other vessels from across the galaxy, ships that looked like living creatures or geometric impossibilities that hurt to look at. Jake Morrison stood beside the captain and watched everything with the careful eyes of a military strategist. He noted defensive positions and weapon placements even though this was supposed to be a peaceful meeting. Old habits from his years in Earth's defense forces never quite faded away. Sophie Bennett clutched her research pad close to her chest and reviewed her notes one more time. As Earth's chief xenobiologist, she had studied every scrap of information about alien cultures, but nothing could truly prepare someone for meeting beings from beyond the stars. She hoped her work would help humanity make a good impression and build bridges between worlds. The ship shuddered slightly as it locked into the docking clamps, and then everything went still. The delegation walked through corridors that seemed to shift and change around them, walls that looked like liquid crystal and floors that felt soft under their feet. Other beings passed them in the halls, creatures with too many limbs or no limbs at all, entities made of light or shadow or things that existed in ways human minds struggled to comprehend. Lisa kept her expression calm and diplomatic even though inside she felt like a child visiting a palace for the first time. The council chamber opened before them like the mouth of some vast cathedral. The ceiling rose so high it disappeared into darkness and the walls curved away in all directions. 12 platforms floated in a circle around a central space, and on each platform sat representatives of the founding species. Lisa saw the crystalline being that records identified as Zetharok of the Velkari, and its body refracted light into rainbow patterns that danced across the floor. The Krathan representative looked like a mantis the size of a small car with compound eyes that seemed to look in every direction at once. Other beings defied easy description, and Lisa forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Derek stepped forward and spoke the greeting they had practiced. He welcomed the council on behalf of humanity and offered friendship and trade between their peoples. His voice echoed in the vast chamber and then fell silent. For a long moment nothing happened, and then the sound began. It started as a low rumble and grew into something unmistakable. The council was laughing at them. Zetharok's voice came through translation devices, and the sound was like breaking glass. The crystalline being spoke of humanity's brief existence, barely 10,000 years of recorded history, compared to civilizations that had ruled the stars for millions of years. The Krathan clicked and chittered about human military strength, calling their weapons primitive toys that could not harm even the smallest council vessel. The Dromani, beings that floated in tanks of colored liquid, made sounds that the translators rendered as mockery about human emotions and how feelings made species weak and easy to control. Lisa felt anger rising in her chest, but she pushed it down and kept her face neutral. She had expected many reactions, but not this casual dismissal, this treatment of humanity as some kind of joke. Jake's hand moved subtly toward his sidearm before he remembered where they were, and forced himself to relax. Sophie's eyes went wide as she watched beings millions of years old laugh at everything humanity had achieved. The council's leader, an entity whose species name humans could not pronounce, finally spoke. Its words came through the translator as cold and final. Humanity would become a tributary species, paying taxes to the council and accepting their rule, or they would face isolation from galactic civilization. Worse things might follow if they proved difficult. The council gave Earth 20 days to decide and make the only choice that made sense. Lisa stepped forward and her voice cut through the chamber like a blade. She spoke clearly and without hesitation. Humanity would not bow to any empire and they would not pay tribute to anyone. Earth was free and would remain free no matter what threats the council made. The words seemed to surprise the ancient beings, and then they laughed again, harder this time. Other species had said such things before, and all of them eventually submitted when they understood the reality of council power. The human delegation turned and walked from the chamber with their heads held high. Behind them the laughter continued and rang in their ears. They returned to their ship in silence, each of them processing what had just happened. This first contact had gone worse than anyone imagined, and the future looked dark indeed. Derek was heading to his quarters when Jake grabbed his arm and pulled him aside. The military strategist had been monitoring communications, and his face looked grim. He showed Derek his tablet, and the captain felt his blood turn cold. The intercepted transmissions were coded, but human computers had cracked them easily. The council was already planning an attack on Earth, a demonstration of force to show the galaxy what happened to species that defied their rule. They would strike in 30 days, giving Earth barely any warning before the hammer fell. Lisa joined them in the corridor and read the intelligence report. Her diplomatic training kept her voice steady, but her hands shook slightly. Sophie came last, and when she saw the news, her research pad slipped from her fingers and clattered on the floor. The four humans stood together and looked at each other. Everything had changed in a single moment. Earth was not joining a community of peaceful civilizations. Earth was about to fight for its very survival against enemies who commanded the power of stars. The horizon's edge broke free from the station and turned toward home. Behind them, the council continued their business, already forgetting about the brief amusement that humanity had provided. They had crushed 1,000 species before, and they would crush 1,000 more. One more world falling under their control meant nothing in the vast scope of their empire. But they had made one critical mistake. They had laughed at human resolve without understanding what that resolve truly meant. In the days to come, they would learn that lesson in blood and fire and the breaking of empires. The ship accelerated toward Earth and carried with it the news that would unite humanity like nothing before. War was coming, and humanity would either rise to meet it or die trying. The council had spoken their judgment, but the final word had not yet been written. The emergency broadcast reached every corner of Earth simultaneously, and billions of people stopped what they were doing to watch the screens. Admiral Helen Carter stood at the podium in Geneva, and her weathered face showed no fear as she delivered the news that would change everything. The Galactic Sovereignty Council had rejected Earth's bid for peaceful relations and was sending a war fleet to make an example of humanity. The attack would come in less than 30 days, and the enemy possessed technology and numbers that made victory seem impossible. Panic rippled through the streets of every major city, but it did not last long. Something unexpected happened in those first hours after the announcement. Governments that had spent centuries arguing with each other fell silent and then reached out across old borders. Ancient grievances suddenly seemed meaningless when faced with extinction. Within 48 hours, every nation on Earth signed the Unity Accord and placed their military forces under a single command. Humanity had never been truly united before, but the threat from the stars accomplished what diplomacy never could. Helen Carter found herself in command of every warship, every soldier, every weapon that humanity possessed. It was not as impressive as it sounded. Earth had ships that could travel between stars, but they were exploration vessels, not warships. Human weapons were designed to fight other humans, not beings with technology millions of years more advanced. The military had war plans for dozens of scenarios, but none of them covered fighting an interstellar empire. She looked at the projections and saw only one path forward. If humanity was going to die, then they would die fighting, and they would make the Council remember Earth's name. Protocol Endurance came out of classified archives where it had waited for decades. Military planners had always wondered what humanity would do if they met hostile aliens, and now they had their answer. The protocol called for total mobilization, the conversion of every factory and shipyard to military production, and the implementation of experimental weapons that had never been tested in actual combat. Helen signed the authorization codes, and across the planet the machinery of war began to turn. Colonel Marcus Webb received his orders at 3 in the morning and was in the air heading for Colorado within the hour. His special operations teams had trained for impossible missions, and this qualified better than most. Webb had spent 20 years learning how to fight enemies with superior numbers and technology. Guerrilla warfare, asymmetric tactics, hit-and-run attacks, these were the tools that let the weak defeat the strong. He gathered his officers and began planning operations that would either save humanity or be forgotten when Earth burned. Dr. Richard Cross barely slept during those first weeks. His laboratory deep beneath the Nevada desert held secrets that most people did not know existed. Quantum disruption weapons, gravitational bombs, experimental drives that could tear holes in space itself. None of them had been tested properly, and some of them might kill everyone who tried to use them. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Earth was well past desperate. He ran simulation after simulation and pushed his team to their limits. If human technology could not match Council weapons, then humans would have to invent something completely new. Lieutenant Samantha Brooks sat in the cockpit of her fighter and ran through pre-flight checks for the 10th time that day. She was one of Earth's best pilots, with reflexes enhanced by neural implants and skills honed through thousands of hours in simulation. Her squadron had won every competition and training exercise for 3 years running, but competitions were games, and this was going to be real. She thought about the alien pilots she would face, beings with millions of years of experience, and she pushed the fear down deep. Her hands moved over the controls with practiced ease, and the fighter responded like an extension of her body. General Sue. Nathan Pierce coordinated the defense from his command center and watched data flow across dozens of screens. Manufacturing plants were retooling to produce weapons. Shipyards were launching vessels in various states of completion. Soldiers were training with equipment that still had bugs in the systems. Everything was happening too fast, and nothing was ready but ready, or not. The council was coming. He spoke with Helen Carter 3 times a day, and they both knew the odds. 500 council ships against less than 200 human vessels. Technology that humanity barely understood against weapons that Earth had just invented. It should have been hopeless, but Nathan had learned long ago that should have been and actually were stood miles apart. The horizon's edge slipped back into council space like a ghost, its stealth systems keeping it hidden from sensors that should have detected it easily. Derek Hamilton had volunteered for this mission, even though it probably meant dying far from home. Jake Morrison sat at the tactical station and worked his magic with the alien computer systems. Human hackers had one advantage that the council never expected. They were creative and ruthless in ways that civilizations bound by millions of years of tradition could not imagine. Jake broke through firewall after firewall and pulled data from systems that should have been impossible to breach. The intelligence they gathered changed everything. The council military had not fought a real war in 3,000 years. Their last major conflict ended before humans learned to write, and since then they had faced no serious opposition. Their ships were powerful, but their tactics were ceremonial, more about display than efficiency. Their weapons were devastating, but crews had no experience using them in actual combat. The council had grown soft and complacent behind their wall of technological superiority. They believed their reputation alone would make enemies surrender. Sophie Bennett made another discovery that gave humanity hope. She studied the data Jake stole and found patterns in council communication networks. Many species under council rule were not happy subjects, but conquered peoples forced into submission. The Zephyr had fought against council forces 800 years ago and lost everything. Their worlds were occupied, their culture suppressed, their people forced to serve in council fleets. But resistance movements still existed, in the shadows, and waited for any chance to strike back at their oppressors. Lisa Martinez opened secret channels to Zephyr resistance. Leaders in the conversations were difficult at first. The Zephyr had seen species try to fight the council before, and they had watched every rebellion crushed absolutely. Why should they believe humans would be any different? Lisa had no good answer except that humanity refused to give up, and maybe that stubbornness would be enough. She shared intelligence about council fleet movements and offered to coordinate resistance activities with Earth's defense. The Zephyr leaders were skeptical, but they were also desperate for any hope. The council war fleet gathered in orbit above their capital world, and the sight was meant to inspire terror across the galaxy. 500 ships, each one larger than anything humanity had built, each one carrying enough firepower to turn planets into ash. The crews prepared for what they thought would be a simple mission: jump to the human homeworld, destroy their pathetic defenses, bombard their cities until surrender came or nothing remained. They broadcast their departure across all frequencies, so everyone would know that the Council's judgment was coming. On Earth, Admiral Carter watched the countdown and allowed herself one moment of doubt. Then she pushed it away and focused on the task ahead. The Council expected frightened primitives begging for mercy. They would find something very different. Human engineers had turned the asteroid belt into a minefield and the moon into a fortress. Every ship in the fleet had orders to ignore safety protocols and push their systems past rated limits. Marcus Webb's teams were already moving toward objectives that would surprise even the most paranoid Council strategist. Richard Cross had delivered 12 prototype weapons and said they would either work perfectly or explode spectacularly. The military academies taught that wars were won by superior numbers and technology, but history told a different story. Wars were won by whoever wanted victory more and was willing to pay any price to achieve it. The Council fought to maintain their empire and protect their status. Humanity fought for the right to exist and for the future of their children. That difference would matter more than anyone realized. Samantha Brooks lifted off from the lunar base along with 500 other fighters and felt the acceleration push her back into her seat. Her squadron formed up around her and they accelerated toward the outer solar system. Somewhere beyond Jupiter, the Council fleet was coming, and soon the galaxy would learn what human resolve truly meant. The waiting was over and the war had begun. The Council fleet emerged from slipspace at the edge of Earth's solar system, and their sensors immediately began scanning for the expected surrender broadcasts. Zetharok stood on the bridge of the flagship and watched the primitive star system spread across the display. The crystalline being felt only mild interest in this mission. Another young species would learn why the Council ruled the galaxy, and then the fleet would return home to celebrate another easy victory. The scan results showed unusual silence from the human homeworld, and that seemed odd but not concerning. Perhaps they were too frightened to respond. The fleet formed into their traditional sphere formation, a massive ball of warships that had intimidated countless civilizations over the millennia. They advanced toward the inner system at a leisurely pace because there was no need to hurry. The humans had nothing that could threaten Council vessels, and everyone knew it. The junior officers on various ships felt excited because this would be their first taste of combat, even if it barely qualified as such. Senior commanders were already thinking about the ceremonies and promotions that would follow this demonstration. Of Council power, Rachel Stone sat in the command chair of the Shadow of Neptune and watched her sensor display with predator's eyes. Her stealth ship and 49 others like it hung motionless in the black between stars, invisible to Council scanners that were designed to detect massive energy signatures, not small vessels running silent. She had been holding position for 6 days, waiting for this moment, and now it had arrived. Her crew was handpicked from the best Earth had to offer, and every single one of them knew this mission was probably suicide. They had volunteered anyway. The Council fleet passed Jupiter's orbit and continued inward without any indication they knew human ships were shadowing them. Rachel waited until the entire enemy formation was committed to their trajectory, and then she gave the order. 50 stealth ships lit their drives simultaneously and accelerated toward targets that had been selected weeks ago. Not the massive dreadnoughts that formed the fleet's core, but the supply vessels, the communication ships, the command and control platforms that kept 500 ships working together as a single unit. The first Council ship died without ever knowing it was under attack. Human torpedoes struck its hull and tore through shields that were designed to stop energy weapons, not kinetic projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. The explosion bloomed like a small star, and then 12 more ships died in the same manner. Alarm signals flashed across Council networks, and commanders who had never experienced actual combat fumbled to understand what was happening. Their formation began to break apart as ships tried to locate an enemy they could not see. Rachel's ship dove through the chaos and fired again at a communications platform that was trying to coordinate the Council response. The Shadow of Neptune's quantum disruption cannon, one of Richard Cross's experimental weapons, tore through the alien vessel's shields like they did not exist. The platform broke apart in a cascade of secondary explosions and took with it the command network for an entire section of the Council fleet. Human pilots exploited the confusion and struck again and again, never staying still long enough for enemy weapons to lock onto them. Vice Admiral Greg Holmes watched the battle unfold from his command post on Mars and allowed himself a brief smile. The first phase was working better than anyone had dared hope. The Council was reeling from an attack they had not imagined possible. But they still had overwhelming numbers, and eventually they would adapt. He opened channels to the second phase units and gave them the order to execute. The asteroid belt came alive with hidden weapons. Chris Dalton had spent 3 weeks in a spacesuit preparing the asteroids, and he was ready for this moment. His teams had selected thousands of rocks in the belt and hollowed them out to make room for nuclear warheads, conventional explosives, and whatever else the engineers could pack inside. Now, as the Council fleet tried to reform and push toward Earth, those asteroids began to move. Some were on intercept courses, while others simply sat waiting to be detonated when enemy ships passed nearby. The Council fleet's sensors finally detected the asteroids, but by then it was too late. The rocks came at them from every direction, and point defense systems struggled to track so many targets simultaneously. Commanders ordered their ships to fire, and space lit up with energy beams that vaporized dozens of asteroids. But hundreds more got through, and when they reached the Council formation, they exploded all at once. The combined force of thousands of nuclear weapons detonating in a confined space created a firestorm that consumed the fleet's vanguard. 37 ships died in less than a minute, and the survivors were blinded and disoriented. Admiral Helen Carter chose that moment to commit her main fleet. 200 human warships that had been hiding behind Mars and the Moon burst into view and accelerated toward the enemy at speeds that should have torn them apart. Human engineers had stripped out safety systems and armor to make room for more engines and weapons. The ships would not survive many hits, but they were fast enough to avoid getting hit in the first place. Her captains had trained for this kind of fighting, the quick strike and rapid retreat that let smaller forces defeat larger ones. Samantha Brooks led her fighter wing through the Council fleets, disintegrating formation, and her neural implants processed, targeting data faster than conscious thought. She selected a target, fired, and moved on before the enemy could respond. Her squadron followed her lead, and together they carved through Council ships like sharks through a school of fish. The alien pilots tried to engage, but they were trained for ceremonial formations, not dogfighting. Human pilots who grew up playing combat simulators and competing against each other flew circles around opponents with millions of years of experience, but no real skill. The quantum disruption weapons proved devastating. Council shields had not been updated in millennia because nothing had threatened them for so long. Richard Cross's invention exploited fundamental flaws in the ancient technology, and every hit from a disruption cannon meant a kill. Human ships that would have been outgunned in a fair fight suddenly found themselves punching far above their weight. The Council's technological advantage vanished in the face of innovation driven by desperation, but numbers still mattered, and the Council had numbers. They absorbed the losses and pressed forward toward Earth with grim determination. Zetharok ordered maximum acceleration and threw away the careful formations in favor of a direct assault. If they could reach the human homeworld and begin bombardment, then the battle would be won regardless of losses. The fleet's remaining ships pushed their drives to maximum and covered the distance to Earth orbit in hours that should have taken days. Karen White coordinated the emergency response from her bunker beneath Geneva and watched with horror as Council ships broke through the orbital defense grid. The first bombardment beam struck cities on the night side and turned them into craters of molten glass. Millions died in seconds, and millions more would follow unless something stopped the attack. She opened channels to the ground-based defenses and gave them weapons-free authorization. Every railgun, every missile battery, every directed energy weapon that Earth possessed opened fire at once. The sky above Earth became a wall of light as human defenses poured everything they had into the Council ships. The aliens had expected token resistance, not a planet armed to the teeth and willing to fight to the last shell. Ships that came too close to the atmosphere were torn apart by weapons fire from the surface. The Council had firepower advantage, but Earth had position and desperation. The battle descended into a brutal exchange where both sides took terrible casualties and neither would yield. Lieutenant Chris Dalton stood on the walls of what used to be London and fired a shoulder-mounted missile at a Council ship that was lining up for another bombardment run. The missile streaked upward and struck true, adding its small contribution to the thousands of weapons that were filling the sky. Around him, soldiers from a dozen nations fought side by side, and when one fell, another took their place. The city was already half destroyed, but they would not surrender while they could still fight. Then something impossible happened. 17 Council ships suddenly changed their transponder codes, and their weapons swung away from Earth to target their former allies. Rachel Stone saw it first from her battered stealth ship and could not believe her sensors. Then the communication came through, broadcast in standard council language with a human translation attached. The Zephyr had waited 800 years for someone to prove the council could be beaten, and now that proof had arrived. They were done serving their oppressors. The tide turned in that moment. Council ships found themselves fighting enemies on all sides, attacked by humans from without and traitors from within. Their formation collapsed completely, and individual captains made their own decisions about whether to continue the assault or retreat to safety. Most chose survival over glory. Zetharok watched the battle fall apart and felt something the ancient being had never experienced before. Fear. The Council fleet, the unstoppable armada that had ruled the galaxy for millennia, was being defeated by primitives and rebels. The order to retreat came too late for many ships. The news traveled across the galaxy faster than anyone expected, and resistance movements that had hidden in shadows for centuries suddenly found their courage. On Zephyr Prime, the population took to the streets and tore down council monuments that had stood for 800 years. On the Krill homeworld, workers in the factories stopped production of weapons meant to enforce council rule and demanded independence. A dozen worlds that had suffered under occupation for generations saw what Earth had done and decided they would rather die fighting than live as slaves. Commander Alex Turner found himself leading expeditionary forces to systems he had never heard of before the war began. His ships arrived at Zephyr Prime to find the population already in open revolt, and Council garrison forces trapped in their bases. Alex did not come to conquer but to help, and that difference mattered. Human soldiers fought alongside Zephyr rebels, and together they drove the Council troops off the planet. When the fighting ended, Alex met with Zephyr leaders and offered them something the Council never had: freedom to govern themselves and weapons to defend that freedom. Ambassador Kelly Ross traveled with Alex and worked to build connections between the liberated worlds. She had learned from Lisa Martinez's example and understood that winning battles meant nothing if you lost the peace that followed. Kelly spoke with representatives from a dozen species and listened to their stories of life under Council control. The picture that emerged was grim. The Council had ruled through fear and overwhelming force, crushing any hint of resistance and keeping conquered peoples divided against each other. But now that the fear was broken, the galaxy was ready for something new. Captain Daniel Myers and Lieutenant Maya Johnson established an intelligence network that spanned former Council territory. They recruited agents from every species that had reason to hate their former masters, and soon information was flowing back to Earth faster than Council forces could react. Daniel discovered that the ancient empire was not as strong as it appeared. Many of their core worlds were suffering from population decline and economic stagnation. The founding species had grown old and complacent, while the younger races they conquered remained vigorous and angry. Dr. Philip Grant studied the data coming from the intelligence network, and his analysis painted a troubling picture. The Council's collapse could create a power vacuum that led to chaos across the galaxy. Species that had been enemies before the Council conquered them might return to old conflicts. Pirates and warlords could seize control of systems that lost their garrisons. Humanity had to be careful that liberation did not become just another form of conquest. Earth could not rule the galaxy and should not try. Lisa Martinez faced the hardest diplomatic challenge of her career. The Council had sent messages requesting negotiations and offering concessions if Earth would halt its support for the rebellion. Part of her wanted to reject them outright after everything they had done, but she knew that pure revenge would make humanity no better than the empire they had defeated. She agreed to meet with Council representatives in neutral space, and the conversations that followed were tense and bitter. The Velkari diplomat who met with Lisa was younger than Zetharok and less certain of Council superiority. The crystalline being spoke of the need for order and stability, of how the galaxy had enjoyed thousands of years of peace under Council rule. Lisa listened and then asked a simple question. If the Council brought peace, then why were so many worlds celebrating their defeat? The diplomat had no good answer. The truth was that the Council had confused submission for peace, and now the confusion was costing them everything. Helen Carter rebuilt Earth's fleet while keeping one eye on Council territory. Her scouts reported that the ancient empire was pulling its forces back to core systems and abandoning outer regions it could no longer hold. Some Council commanders were trying to maintain order, but others were simply fleeing with whatever ships and resources they could grab. The empire that had seemed eternal was coming apart faster than anyone imagined possible. Helen worried about what would replace it. Back on Earth, people were still processing what had happened. The Battle of Terra had cost millions of lives and left deep scars across the planet. Memorials went up in every city for those who died defending humanity's freedom. Sophie Bennett visited one such memorial in what used to be Singapore, and read the names carved in stone. So many dead, so much sacrifice, all because the Council could not accept that a young species might choose its own path. She wondered if the cost had been worth it, and then felt guilty for even asking that question. The Zephyr sent a delegation to Earth, and their leader spoke before a packed assembly in the rebuilt Geneva Hall. The mammalian aliens' words came through translators, but the emotion needed no interpretation. For 800 years, the Zephyr had dreamed of freedom, and Earth had made that dream real. They offered humanity their eternal friendship and their support in building a better galaxy. The response from the human audience was thunderous applause that seemed to shake the building. For the first time since the war ended, people dared to believe that something good might come from all the suffering. Marcus Webb met with resistance leaders from across the galaxy and shared tactics that had worked for Earth. He'd taught them about asymmetric warfare and how small groups could tie down much larger forces. He showed them how to use the enemy's own technology against them and how to turn the population into an intelligence network that was impossible to defeat. Some of the resistance leaders were uncomfortable with Webb's methods because they seemed ruthless, but he reminded them that the Council had shown no mercy to their worlds. Fighting fair was for people who could afford to lose. Then everything changed when Daniel Myers intercepted communications that made his blood run cold. The Council was preparing to activate weapons they called the Dread Weapons, ancient machines sealed away after a war that nearly destroyed the galaxy millions of years ago. The Council leadership had debated this decision for weeks, and finally desperation won out. If they could not maintain their empire through conventional force, then they would use weapons of extinction. 3 dread weapons would be awakened and sent to destroy the centers of resistance, including Earth itself. The news reached Helen Carter while she was inspecting repairs on one of her damaged cruisers. She read the report twice to make sure she understood it correctly, and then felt a weight settle onto her shoulders that made the previous war seem easy by comparison. The Council was willing to commit genocide on a galactic scale rather than accept defeat. These dread weapons were not ships but moon-sized constructs with firepower that could sterilize entire star systems. Earth's fleet had fought brilliantly against conventional forces, but against weapons designed to kill planets, they would be helpless. She called an emergency council with all the senior commanders and diplomats. Derek Hamilton attended via video link from where the Horizon's Edge was operating near former council space. Jake Morrison brought what little intelligence they had gathered about the dread weapons. Richard Cross admitted that his weapons would be useless against constructs that large and powerful. The mood in the room was grim because everyone understood what they were facing. Humanity had won the first war, but now a second war was beginning, and this one might be unwinnable. Lisa Martinez spoke up and reminded everyone that they had faced impossible odds before. The Council had come to Earth with 500 ships and absolute confidence in victory. They had left with their fleet broken and their empire crumbling. Maybe the dread weapons were not as unstoppable as the Council believed. Maybe there was a weakness that could be exploited. They had to try because giving up was not an option. The alternative was extinction, not just for humanity but for every species that had dared to defy the Council. Sophie Bennett volunteered to dig through every scrap of information they had gathered about Council history. There had to be something in their records about the dread weapons, some clue about how they worked or why they had been sealed away. She spent 72 hours going through databases with barely any sleep. Her eyes burned and her head ached, but she kept searching. Then she found it buried in files that were millions of years old and protected by encryption that took human computers days to crack. The dread weapons were not purely mechanical constructs. They were controlled by organic cores, the preserved consciousness of ancient Council warriors who had been promised eternal glory. Instead, they had been trapped in machines for millions of years, forced to kill on command whenever the Council needed them. Sophie saw a possibility in that information. If the dread weapons had consciousness, then maybe they could be reasoned with. Maybe they were prisoners who wanted freedom as much as any conquered species. She brought her findings to the command council and watched as understanding dawned on their faces. Helen Carter began planning how to divide the fleet to intercept all three dread weapons. Derek Hamilton volunteered to approach the machines and attempt communication. Kelly Ross would craft the message that might convince ancient warriors to choose peace over continued slavery. It was a desperate plan with almost no chance of success, but it was better than no plan at all. The dread weapons activated in different sectors in their signatures. The first dread weapon emerged from slipspace near the Zephyr homeworld, and its appearance made veteran warriors weep in despair. The construct was the size of Earth's moon, but shaped like some vast geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly. Energy readings from its core showed power levels that should have torn it apart, but somehow the ancient machine held together through technologies no living being understood. Long-range sensors detected weapons ports that could unleash destruction across an entire planet with a single blast. The Zephyr fleet moved to intercept even though they knew it was suicide. Derek Hamilton brought the Horizon's Edge close enough to the dread weapon to feel its gravitational pull dragging on his ship. Maya Johnson sat at the communication station and prepared to broadcast the message that Kelly Ross had spent days crafting. They had one chance to reach whatever consciousness existed inside that machine before it destroyed everything in its path. Derek gave the signal and Maya opened all channels at maximum power. Human words translated into the ancient council language poured toward the dread weapon. The message was simple but powerful. It spoke of warriors who had been promised glory, but were given only endless servitude. It acknowledged the terrible things the dread weapon had been forced to do over millions of years. It offered something that no one had given these ancient beings in all that time: freedom and rest, the choice to stop fighting and finally find peace. The message repeated over and over while Derek held position and waited for a response that might never come. Inside the dread weapon, something stirred. The organic core that controlled the massive machine had not heard words like these in eons. It remembered being a warrior once, remembered having a name and a people and a life beyond killing. The council had taken all of that away and turned it into a weapon that could never die and never stop. The consciousness reached out through ancient systems and examined this human ship that dared approach so close. It saw courage in that approach and something else it had forgotten: compassion. The dread weapon slowed its advance toward Zephyr Prime, and that alone was enough to make billions hold their breath. Maya kept broadcasting the message and added personal elements that Sophie Bennett had suggested. She spoke of warriors deserving honor and rest, of how even the greatest fighter needed to lay down their weapons eventually, of how true strength sometimes meant choosing peace. The words seemed inadequate against millions of years of programming, but they were all humanity had, Helen. Carter approached the second dread weapon near the Krill system with her task force and saw weapons charging that could vaporize her entire fleet in seconds. She opened communications and added her voice to the message Derek was broadcasting across the galaxy. Helen spoke as one warrior to another and acknowledged the service these ancient beings had given. She promised that if they stopped now, their stories would be remembered with respect, not as monsters, but as warriors who finally chose their own path. The dread weapons continued charging, but it did not fire. Alex Turner led the third task force to intercept the dread weapon, heading for Earth, and found himself face to face with the machine that had haunted council nightmares for millions of years. His hands shook on the controls because this thing could destroy his homeworld before he could even react. But he kept his voice steady as he broadcast the message and added his own words. He spoke of sacrifice and duty, and how sometimes the bravest thing a warrior could do was refuse to fight. The dread weapon did not slow down, and Earth's orbital defenses prepared for their final battle. Then something extraordinary happened. The first dread weapon near Zephyr Prime stopped moving completely. Its weapons powered down and its systems began shutting themselves off one by one. Maya received a transmission in a language so old that human computers took minutes to translate it. The words were simple: enough, no more killing, let me sleep. Derek felt tears running down his face as he watched the massive construct go dormant. The organic core inside had chosen peace after millions of years of war. The second dread weapon hesitated, and Helen Carter saw her chance. She broadcast personal messages from the Zephyr and other liberated species, thanking the ancient warrior for stopping. She explained that the galaxy was changing and that weapons of extinction had no place in the future that was being built. The dread weapon's consciousness processed this information and reached a conclusion. The Council had enslaved it for millions of years, but these young species offered something the Council never had: a choice. The machine's weapons powered down and it transmitted coordinates for where it wanted to be taken, a place where it could finally rest. Alex Turner watched the third dread weapon approaching Earth and knew they had run out of time. The construct was close enough now that even if it stopped, its momentum would carry it into firing range. He made a decision that probably meant his death. His ship accelerated directly toward the dread weapon on a collision course while broadcasting the message at maximum volume. If words could not stop this thing, then maybe sacrifice would. Maybe this ancient warrior would understand what it meant to give your life for something greater than yourself. The dread weapons locked onto Alex's ship, and everyone watching from Earth knew what would come next. Then the impossible happened again. The weapons powered down and the massive construct altered course to avoid the tiny human ship. A transmission came through in that ancient language, and this time the translation was immediate, because the consciousness had learned human speech patterns. It spoke of courage and warriors recognizing other warriors across the vast gulf of time. It chose to stop not because of threats or force, but because humanity had shown it something it thought was lost forever. Honor. The three dread weapons went dormant, and the galaxy released a breath it had been holding. The Council's final weapon had failed not through combat but through compassion. The news spread faster than the speed of light seemed to allow, and on every world people celebrated. The ancient machines that had terrorized civilizations for millions of years had chosen peace because humans asked them to. That single act said more about Earth's place in the galaxy than any battle could. The Council sent word that they wanted to negotiate a formal end to hostilities. Zetharok was no longer leading their delegation. Instead, younger members of the founding species came forward, beings who had grown up knowing only peace and suddenly found themselves inheriting an empire in collapse. They were frightened and uncertain but willing to talk. Lisa Martinez met with them and saw not the arrogant overlords who had laughed at humanity, but people who wanted to find a way forward. The negotiations took months and involved representatives from 47 different species. Humanity deliberately limited its own influence because they understood the danger of replacing one empire with another. The Galactic Assembly formed with a charter that protected self-determination for all species and prevented any single civilization from dominating others. It was not perfect, and everyone knew conflicts would still happen, but at least now there was a framework for resolving disputes without war. Marcus Webb established the Assembly, defense force with volunteers from dozens of worlds. Its mission was not to conquer, but to protect species who could not defend themselves. He trained soldiers from across the galaxy in the tactics that had defeated the Council, and he emphasized that strength was only valuable when used to protect the weak, not exploit them. Many of his recruits were former Council, soldiers who wanted to rebuild their honor by serving something better than the empire they had known. 5 years after the Battle of Terra, the Assembly Hall opened in neutral space between major civilizations. Species that had been enemies worked together to build something unprecedented in galactic history, a true union based on cooperation, not domination. Derek Hamilton attended the opening ceremony and watched representatives from hundreds of worlds gather peacefully. He thought about how close they had come to extinction and how improbable their survival had been. Humanity could have died in their first contact with an alien civilization, but instead they changed the galaxy. Helen Carter stood at a podium and delivered her final address before retirement. She spoke of the journey humanity had taken, from being dismissed as primitives to becoming respected members of galactic civilization. She explained that Earth had not won through superior weapons or technology, but through refusing to surrender their core values: dignity, freedom, and the belief that cooperation was stronger than domination. These principles had shattered an empire that ruled for thousands of years, and they would be the foundation of whatever came next. Lisa Martinez worked with representatives from liberated worlds to establish trade networks and cultural exchanges. She watched as species who had spent centuries under Council oppression rediscovered their own histories and traditions. The galaxy was flowering in ways it had not done in millennia, and humanity had helped make that possible. She thought about the Council chamber where ancient beings had laughed at human resolve, and she smiled. That laughter seemed like it happened in another lifetime, On Earth, a memorial stood listing every person who died defending humanity and liberating others. Visitors from across the galaxy came to pay respects and leave tokens from their homeworlds.